In the heart of ancient Babylon, beneath the vast shadow cast by the towering ziggurat of Atemenanki, a child was born. It was the 3rd day of Nisanu, at the edge of spring, when the 2 rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, began swelling gently, bringing life to the fertile plains. The boy's cries echoed faintly amidst the clay-walled houses, resonating with an innocence that seemed to stir the city itself. His father, Nabu-erib, a skilled potter renowned for the delicate symmetry of his vessels, cradled him gently, his clay-stained fingers trembling slightly with awe. His mother, Lilitu, known for her melodious voice, which graced the temple hymns dedicated to Ishtar, gazed into her newborn's dark eyes and whispered blessings softly. May your voice be the whisper of gods. May your hands shape destinies. They named him Enlil-beli-usur, meaning Enlil protects the air, a humble yet auspicious title invoking one of the greatest gods, guardian of wind and earth. This name, chosen carefully and inscribed upon a tiny clay amulet placed beneath his head, signified the promise and hope his family held. The modest home, with its thick mud brick walls, opened to a small courtyard, where a single fig tree grew, a silent guardian. The fig tree had witnessed countless sunrises, and beneath its boughs, generations had shared stories, secrets, and silences. Now it cast gentle shade upon the cradle where the newborn lay. Neighbors came quietly to offer blessings, bringing tokens of goodwill, dates sweetened with honey, jars of barley beer, small carved figures of protective gods. Among these visitors was an old astrologer, Ur-Nana, whose sharp eyes read omens not just in the stars, but in the tiniest of moments. Holding the infant, Ur-Nana studied his tiny clenched fists and murmured gently to Nabu-erib, "This child carries the weight of words. Guard him carefully, for his fingers shall one day shape the thoughts of kings." Days and nights blended softly, lulled by the gentle rhythm of Lilitu's singing and the comforting warmth of their hearth fire. Even then, the infant seemed to listen more intently than most, his dark eyes following movements, sounds, whispers of the bustling city beyond. From this modest beginning, beneath the vast ziggurat's shadow, among the whispered blessings, and watched over by the fig tree, Enlil-beli-usur began his quiet journey. Unbeknownst to all, including himself, he would indeed shape the fate of kings and preserve the memory of an entire civilization through the subtle power of his stylus. As Enlil-beli-usur grew, he displayed a quiet fascination with everything around him. By the age of 4, the toddler wandered confidently through the narrow lanes of Babylon, his small feet padding quietly over worn clay paths, always returning home with pockets full of broken pottery shards, strangely shaped stones, or scraps of clay. Nabu-erib, proud yet bemused by his son's curiosity, built a small table near his pottery wheel, where Enlil-beli-usur would sit for hours, observing his father's steady hands coaxing graceful forms from wet clay. He mimicked these movements, carefully shaping small bowls, animals, and abstract shapes. These small figures were imperfect, yet filled with his burgeoning spirit. His mother, Lilitu, smiled knowingly as he often sat near her loom, absorbing the rhythmic movements and gentle murmuring of temple hymns she chanted. Her songs spoke of Ishtar's compassion, Marduk's might, and Nabu's wisdom, filling the boy's mind with vivid images and stories that nourished his imagination. At 5, his father took him to the banks of the Euphrates. There, amidst reeds taller than he was, Enlil-beli-usur encountered the first tablets he ever saw. Near the riverbank, scribes from the temple's nearby archive discarded broken tablets or practice scraps into a shallow pit. The boy spent hours carefully pulling these broken pieces from the damp earth, fascinated by the tiny wedge-shaped markings. "Father, what are these?" he asked softly, holding up a fragment bearing delicate, mysterious lines. "They are tablets," Nabu-Arib explained gently, squatting beside him. "Words of kings, hymns of gods, records of trade. All that matters to our city lies within these wedges of clay." The boy gazed thoughtfully at the tablets, sensing in their silent script a powerful mystery. He carried the shards home, arranging them on his small table as carefully as treasures from a distant land. Days turned into seasons. The city whispered, hummed, and bustled around the boy, its streets alive with calls of traders, hymns from temples, the barking of dogs, the smell of baking bread. Enlil-beli-usur absorbed it all, his quiet nature drawing him towards stillness, observation, and reflection. At age 6, his fascination turned deliberate. He carved his first stylus from a sturdy reed, sharpened carefully by Nabu-Arib's blade. With trembling fingers, he began to press shapes into wet clay, copying the patterns he saw on the broken fragments. He didn't yet know the meanings, yet the shapes called to him, whispering promises of understanding. Nabu-Arib and Lilitu observed quietly, understanding something important was blossoming. They did not push or rush him. They simply made space for his curiosity to grow, much as Nabu-Arib allowed his clay pot space to shape themselves beneath his patient hands. The turning point arrived one bright morning when Enlil-beli-usur, now 7, brought a tablet he had crafted painstakingly to Ur-Nana, the old astrologer, sitting quietly beneath the ziggurat's shadow. "Show me what you have made, little scribe," Ur-Nana smiled softly. Enlil-beli-usur presented his tablet shyly. Upon it were careful marks, each wedge pressed with effort and reverence. The astrologer's eyes gleamed as he recognized the shapes. "These are not idle scratches, boy. Do you know what you have written?" "No, master," Enlil-beli-usur replied softly, eyes wide. Ur-Nana smiled warmly, recognizing an omen of promise. "This is a prayer to Nabu, the god of wisdom. Your hands wrote it, though your mind does not yet know it. It is an omen that your life is destined for ink and clay." Enlil-beli-usur felt the warmth of pride, tempered by awe and mystery. He returned home that day changed, sensing a greater world beyond the walls of his family's home. He knew now that clay could hold secrets, wisdom, history, life itself. And so, the young boy, enchanted by wedges and whispers, grew steadily towards his destiny, always guided gently by clay, curiosity, and quiet wonder. It was early morning in Babylon, and the first rays of the sun touched the ziggurat's highest step, casting a golden glow across the waking city. Enlil-beli-usur, now 7 years old, walked beside his father, along the familiar clay paths towards a place he had only dreamed of, the famed Eduba, known as the Tablet House. His father, Nabu-Arib, had carefully combed the boy's hair and dressed him in fresh linen robes, lightly scented with myrrh. Enlil-beli-usur felt both excitement and apprehension as they approached the entrance. The Tablet House was a large, sturdy building with thick, mud brick walls, standing solemnly near the temple district. From its open windows floated the rhythmic chant of students reciting their lessons. An elderly gatekeeper greeted them warmly at the entrance. "Ah, Nabu-Erib," he nodded with respect. "Is this the young scribe-to-be you spoke of?" "Yes," Nabu-Erib replied, gently placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "This is Enlil-beli-usur." Inside, the tablet house felt quiet and orderly, filled with the comforting smells of clay and reed mats. A central courtyard open to the sky, sunlight streaming down upon rows of low wooden tables. Students, mostly boys, though a few girls sat quietly among them, bent their heads attentively, styluses poised carefully over damp clay tablets. Each table was overseen by senior scribes, who guided gently yet firmly, correcting form and posture. Urzababa, the master scribe, emerged from a shaded corridor, approaching father and son with measured steps. His eyes were sharp, yet his voice held gentle authority. "So this is Enlil-beli-usur," Urzababa said, inspecting him closely. "I have heard from Ur-Nana that the boy has a gift. Let me see your hands, child." Enlil-beli-usur extended his small hands, still slightly stained from early morning practice. "These are good hands," Urzababa murmured approvingly. "Hands that respect the clay. But can you endure the long days, the repetition, the demands of the stylus?" "Yes, master," the boy answered simply, eyes clear and determined. Urzababa nodded slightly, satisfied. "Then welcome to the tablet house. Come." Enlil-beli-usur followed Urzababa deeper into the school, while Nabu-Erib watched proudly, silently slipping away, knowing his son's journey had truly begun. The boy's first days in the tablet house were arduous. Each morning began with memorization of lists, names of cities, gods, kings, animals, rivers, spoken aloud until their syllables flowed effortlessly. Lessons were long and demanding, covering language, law, mathematics, and astronomy. Afternoons brought practice sessions, pressing hundreds of wedges into clay tablets, each mark corrected firmly by senior apprentices. Mistakes required tablets to be smoothed again, discipline instilled through patient repetition. Evenings were for quiet recitation by lamplight, chanting hymns and laws, imprinting them into memory. Meals were simple: bread, lentil stew, fresh dates, and barley porridge, but nourishing, often eaten silently amidst focused contemplation. Enlil-beli-usur adapted swiftly, guided gently by Urzababa. The master scribe, despite his stern demeanor, had deep kindness in his eyes, recognizing the boy's innate reverence for the task. He taught Enlil-beli-usur not merely how to shape letters, but how to hold meaning, cautioning often, "A scribe does not write words, he guards them." One night, as twilight softened the edges of the city, Urzababa called the boy aside. "Tell me," he asked gently, "why do you wish to be a scribe?" Enlil-beli-usur paused thoughtfully. "Because words hold everything: life, memory, law, and beauty. I wish to hold those words, master." Urzababa smiled softly. "Then you must learn not only how to write, but how to listen. Words speak clearest when you are silent." Over the months, Enlil-beli-usur internalized this wisdom, quietly embracing the rhythms of his new life. He grew adept, steadily mastering the techniques, his wedges becoming clearer, his tablets more precise. Even senior apprentices began noticing his skill. He wrote in his diary one evening, carefully pressing wedges into a personal tablet. Today, I understood clearly. The stylus moves not from the hand, but from the heart. Thus, in quiet diligence, reverence, and humility, Enlil-beli-usur's path forward was etched into clay, his destiny shaped softly and irrevocably beneath the attentive eyes of master and gods alike. Under the watchful guidance of Ur-Zababa, Enlil-beli-usur matured, growing from a child captivated by clay into a dedicated young student of the stylus. Master Ur-Zababa was revered across Babylon, respected not merely for his precision, but for his quiet wisdom and profound understanding of language. His teachings went far beyond technique. They embraced philosophy, ethics, and the deeper spiritual responsibilities of writing. The tablet house days were disciplined, yet deeply enriching. Enlil-beli-usur would arrive at dawn, greeted by the fragrance of cedar resin burned to purify the scriptorium. The students, led by Ur-Zababa, began their mornings with careful recitations of sacred hymns dedicated to Nabu, the god of scribes and wisdom. Their voices rose in gentle unison, setting a rhythm that would carry them through the day's work. Enlil-beli-usur was quickly recognized for his earnestness. Ur-Zababa noted the boy's unusual dedication and often assigned him specialized tasks. He taught him not just how to form letters clearly, but how to imbue each wedge-shaped sign with intention. "Never forget," Ur-Zababa instructed firmly. "Every wedge is a promise. Treat each tablet as sacred ground." The master would frequently observe the students silently from a corner of the room, intervening only occasionally to correct posture or technique. His greatest lessons, however, came during quiet conversations held in shaded corners of the scriptorium, or during slow walks along the Euphrates at dusk. One evening, as the two walked together by the riverbank, Ur-Zababa handed Enlil-beli-usur a freshly cut reed stylus. "Take this reed, Enlil-beli. What do you notice about it?" The boy turned it over in his fingers, observing carefully. "It is straight, master. Strong, but flexible. Simple." "Yes," Ur-Zababa replied softly, "and yet it holds within it infinite possibility. Like the human soul, Enlil-beli, it has potential only realized through careful handling. You must shape it, sharpen it, respect it. Then it will serve you faithfully." Enlil-beli-usur nodded silently, absorbing this wisdom carefully. Over time, the master shared deeper insights about the role scribes held in society. "We scribes," Ur-Zababa taught, "do not merely record. We preserve balance. Words can heal or harm, reveal or obscure. Your stylus can change destinies, young Enlil-beli. Wield it thoughtfully." Ur-Zababa also instilled in him humility, emphasizing the invisible nature of their role. "Kings speak loudly, but scribes speak forever, silently, within clay. Do not crave praise. Seek only precision." Enlil-beli-usur revered these teachings. His stylus became an extension of his soul, its strokes growing confident, steady, precise. His tablets were consistently the clearest, his copies of important texts the most reliable. Yet he never boasted. He understood deeply that his true measure lay not in public praise, but in the quiet satisfaction of a task done impeccably. At age 15, Enlil-beli-usur completed his most important assignment, a full copy of the Code of Hammurabi, the laws of Babylon, etched in perfect cuneiform wedges. He presented the tablet to Ur-Zababa, who studied it carefully in silence. Finally, the old master nodded, eyes bright with pride. This, Enlil-beli, is true mastery. Your wedges speak not just accurately, but honestly. One evening, nearing the completion of his formal education, Ur-Zababa called Enlil-beli-usur to his small room behind the scriptorium. The old scribe was quiet, the lamplight flickering gently across his weathered features. "I have taught many," Ur-Zababa began softly, "but you, Enlil-beli, carry something special, a quiet strength, a deep respect for words. I believe the gods have chosen you to guard something precious. When the day comes, use your stylus not to impress kings, but to serve truth." Enlil-beli-usur bowed his head respectfully. "I will, master." Ur-Zababa smiled warmly, placing a gentle hand on his student's shoulder. "Soon, the palace will call for you, as it always calls for my best apprentices. Remember, in the great halls, you may be asked to bend words. Hold firm. Let the truth shape your stylus, never the other way around." That night, alone beneath the stars, Enlil-beli-usur etched a single line upon his personal tablet. "Today, my master entrusted me with truth. May my stylus never betray it." In that moment, guided by the wisdom of Ur-Zababa, the boy truly became the scribe he was always meant to be, humble, reverent, and deeply aware of the quiet, sacred power he wielded. The year Enlil-beli-usur turned 17, the omens changed. A comet appeared above the city for 7 nights, glowing red like molten bronze, arcing over the ziggurat of Etemenanki, and casting its reflection into the Euphrates. The astrologers read its shape and declared it an omen. "A voice shall rise, steady as the stars. The king shall hear it, not in thunder, but in silence." The following week, a royal messenger arrived at the tablet house. He wore the king's seal upon a bronze chain and carried a scroll wrapped in red silk. He asked for Ur-Zababa and Enlil-beli-usur by name. The entire Eduba fell into respectful silence as the messenger bowed and presented the scroll to the master scribe. Ur-Zababa read its contents with a still face, then looked at Enlil-beli-usur with quiet gravity. "The king's personal scribe has died," he said, "and the palace, guided by diviners and by your name written in the stars, has called for you." Enlil-beli-usur did not speak. He simply nodded once, the weight of the moment already settling into his chest like wet clay. That night he returned to the garden of his childhood and sat beneath the old fig tree. He pressed a fresh tablet with trembling fingers and wrote, "I have been called by kings. May the gods still find me fit." The next morning he dressed in a new linen robe, gifted by his parents. Lilitu braided his hair with a single strand of indigo thread, Ishtar's color for protection. Nabu-Erib pressed a reed stylus into his son's hand. His own, worn smooth by decades at the pottery wheel, now repurposed and cut to scribe's length. "You have shaped clay with me," his father said quietly. "Now you will shape time." The palace gates loomed tall and blue, enameled with roaring lions and golden bulls. The air within the walls smelled of myrrh and parchment, of roasted meats and heavy silence. Enlil-beli-usur was led through columned halls, past echoing courtyards and guarded doors, until he arrived at the royal scriptorium. There, the chief vizier, a sharp-eyed man named Bel-Aki, awaited him. He studied the young scribe with restrained interest. "You come recommended," Bel-Aki said. "Your handwriting is said to be as precise as the stars, but more than that, your silence is said to be trustworthy. A royal scribe does not merely record, he witnesses." Enlil-beli-usur bowed. "Then let me witness well." He was given a seat within the royal archive, where the scrolls of treaties, laws, tributes, and dreams were stored in orderly rows of clay shelves. His first task was not glamorous. He copied grain tallies from outer provinces. But even in these simple tasks, his skill was noted. His wedges were consistent, his lines aligned, his ink did not smudge, and above all, he never spoke out of turn. Days passed, then weeks. Eventually, he was called to the king's private chamber. King Samsu-iluna, son of the great Hammurabi, sat not on his throne, but on a low seat beside a burning brazier. His eyes were tired, but intelligent. He gestured for Enlil-beli-usur to kneel and offered him a half-burned tablet. "This," the king said, "is a dream I saw last night. I must have it recorded properly. It concerns the fate of Elam. Do not embellish, do not remove, only write what was given." Enlil-beli-usur bowed and accepted the broken tablet. He rewrote the dream with care, line by line, word by word, including every pause and hesitation exactly as the king described it. He sealed the clay, handed it to the vizier, and returned to his place. That evening, the king sent a gift to his home, a finely stitched robe, a basket of honeyed dates, and a sealed tablet bearing 3 words, "The stylus lives." From that day forward, Enlil-beli-usur became known as Sukalu, a royal scribe, not only to the king, but to the empire. He was entrusted with proclamations, trade records, laws, even private letters sealed with wax and fear. He became both shadow and voice, present, silent, ever writing. And every night, before sleep, he lit a small oil lamp before a clay figurine of Nabu and whispered, "Let me write what matters and forget what does not." The royal scriptorium of Babylon was a world within a world, quiet, ordered, and sacred. Set behind the main palace courtyard, beneath arched ceilings painted with constellations, the scriptorium was the beating heart of the kingdom's memory. It was here that the past was preserved, the present recorded, and the future whispered into form. Clay, ink, and fire gave shape to all things: law, prophecy, census, and dream. Enlil-beli-usur entered each morning just before sunrise, before even the guards had finished their shift change. He passed through 3 guarded doors and knelt briefly before a small niche where a carved figure of Nabu stood in silence, stylus pressed against his lips. He was now one of 12 scribes permitted to enter the inner archive, the chamber of eternal clay, where royal tablets were stored in labeled niches, each section organized by dynasty, province, and divine alignment. Tablets wrapped in linen and wax bore markings of treaties long past and oaths not spoken aloud in 100 years. His daily routine began with the inspection of ink and clay. Moisture had to be just right, soft enough to carve, firm enough to dry cleanly. The styluses, made of bone, bronze, or reed, were kept in a row of narrow stone trays, sharpened and oiled the night before. No scribal task began without a short prayer. Enlil-beli-usur would whisper, "May my hand be clear, May my line be just. May my silence be louder than pride. Then the day's work would begin. Some days he copied tax records from outer provinces, sacks of barley, heads of sheep, jars of fish sauce from Uruk, or bricks owed by households near Sippar. Other days he transcribed the king's proclamations, carefully noting pauses in dictation and respectfully avoiding errors. Every word had political weight. Every misplaced wedge could cause confusion, even war. Enlil-beli-usur worked beside scribes of many ranks, some from noble families, others like him, sons of craftsmen. There was Anuzer, a wiry man who specialized in royal correspondence, known for his sly remarks and fast hands. There was Ninkalti, a quiet woman who translated omens and dreams, often muttering under her breath as she carved tablets by torchlight. Enlil-beli respected them all, but preferred silence to camaraderie. He believed the stylus spoke better than the tongue. In the late afternoon, once the daily commissions were complete, Enlil-beli would walk among the older tablets and read from them, studying the forms of his predecessors. He particularly admired the tablets of a long-dead scribe named Lugal-Naid, whose strokes were delicate but firm, like poetry pressed into stone. On occasion, Enlil-beli was called to council chambers, where priests and generals debated treaties or reviewed border reports. He sat against the wall, recording every utterance with precision, his presence never acknowledged aloud, but always understood. He was not a man. He was a vessel, memory, clothed in linen. One day, during a long session regarding a border skirmish with Elam, the king turned mid-sentence and asked, "Scribe, what did the envoy say last season about these terms?" Without hesitation, Enlil-beli retrieved a tablet dated precisely 4 months prior and read aloud, word for word, the envoy's message. The room fell quiet. The king smiled faintly. The stylus remembers better than the tongue. From that day, Enlil-beli was granted unquestioned authority over royal record-keeping. His role came with neither ceremony nor title, only more silence, more weight. But he accepted it with the same reverence he gave to clay. At night, in his private chamber within the palace walls, he would review his work. A small stack of tablets always sat beside his bed, one for royal notes, one for poetic fragments, one for personal prayers, and one he kept completely blank. That tablet was his reminder. A scribe must always leave room for the unknown. In Babylon, it was said that a king's command could shape walls, but a scribe's word could shape time. Enlil-beli-usur, now firmly established as the keeper of royal records, was no longer merely a scribe among scribes. He had become a trusted vessel of memory, the one who ensured that what was spoken in the palace outlived the breath that uttered it. With each passing year, the kingship of Samsu-iluna faced growing trials, boundary disputes with Elam, temple disagreements with the priesthood of Sippar, and unrest among taxed farmers along the Euphrates. As the king's world grew more uncertain, he leaned ever more upon the certainty of Enlil-beli's stylus. His position brought power, but not the kind sung in hymns or praised in market songs. His was the invisible power, to record what was said or not said, to phrase a decree in terms that soothed or sharpened, to preserve a king's word exactly as spoken, or subtly smoothed for posterity. With each wedge he pressed into clay, he asked himself not only, is this true, but will this still be true in 100 years? One day, the king's council met to discuss a troubling incident. A provincial governor had collected double tribute and blamed it on scribal error. The tablets had been altered, clay softened, wedges repressed. Enlil-beli examined them carefully, holding the tablet to the light, running his fingers across the grooves. The deception was subtle, but present. "It has been changed," he said quietly. "Then write the accusation," said the vizier. Enlil-beli looked down at the stylus in his hand and said, "I will write the truth, not the verdict." That night, he wrote not only the event, but the evidence, the dates of softening, the change in wedge angle, the fingerprints along the edge. He did not name guilt. He presented fact. The king read the report, nodded, and whispered, "Let the gods pass judgment." From then on, Enlil-beli was not just recorder, but guardian. He began training a select group of apprentices, not in technique, but in integrity. He taught them how to detect altered clay, how to read silence between lines, how to ask what is missing before what is said. He once told a student who had rushed a legal transcription, "A crooked wedge is a crooked law." He learned to carry two styluses, one for official decrees, the other for personal reflections. In his home, hidden in a cedar box, he kept a secret collection of tablets, records he copied for himself, exact replicas of controversial orders, royal disputes, and decisions that were later buried by politics. He did not share them, he did not speak of them, but he could not let them vanish. He believed that truth, even buried, had weight. In private moments, he sometimes questioned the burden he bore. "What if the king is wrong?" he asked one night to his wife, Enlil-beli, as they sat beneath their fig tree, its leaves rustling in the warm dusk. "Then let the scribe be right," she said softly. "If the king is power, let the scribe be conscience." From then on, Enlil-beli-usur bore the title unofficially whispered among priests and generals, Mushar Sharuti Shulmu, he who makes the king remember. And he did. When border walls were redrawn, he preserved the previous lines. When ancient hymns were rewritten, he stored the originals in secret corners of the archive. When new laws were inscribed, he footnoted the ones they replaced. He did not resist change. He simply recorded its truth. That was his service, not to kings, not to gods, but to memory itself. Though his life was filled with scrolls and silence, Enlil-beli-usur's heart, like the rest of him, was shaped by warmth, tradition, and quiet longing. Amid the order of tablets and law, love came to him not as thunder, but as a slow sunrise, gentle, sure, and undeniable. Her name was Enlil-beli, a priestess in service to Ishtar at the temple near the eastern wall of Babylon. He first saw her one morning during the Akitu festival, the New Year's procession that turned the city into a living hymn. While others were busy chanting or casting petals into the street, Enlil-beli had noticed her standing beneath the gate of Ishtar, her hands raised in ritual blessing, her face radiant in the early light. She did not see him, but he never forgot the calm strength of her presence, the way she moved like water, the way her lips whispered prayers, not for display, but as if truly conversing with the divine. Months passed. Fate returned her to him when he was asked to deliver a ceremonial decree to the temple of Ishtar, an official transcription to be read aloud during a lunar rite. Enlil-beli-usur received the tablet, thanked him softly, and asked, "Are these your hands that shaped this?" He nodded. She smiled. They met again and again. Each visit to the temple brought longer exchanges, initially brief and formal, then slowly opening like date blossoms. He learned she studied healing, tended incense rituals, and composed hymns on spare clay tablets, often late at night when the temple was empty. He spoke little of his own position. She admired that. In time, their meetings became expectation. One evening, under a rising moon, she offered him a cup of cooled mint water and said simply, "You carry silence the way others carry pride." That night, he returned home and pressed a line into his private diary tablet. "Today, I met someone who reads the world as I do, without haste, without noise." And so he did what a proper Babylonian man of his stature must do. He prepared a formal proposal of union. It was not merely a matter of affection, but of law, timing, and ritual. He crafted a special tablet, flat, clean, inscribed with the 7 vows of peaceful joining, a traditional legal and spiritual document promising loyalty, provision, harmony, and respect. Each vow was pressed with his own hand, and the stylus he used was carved from cedar and tipped in lapis lazuli, a token of purity and value. He delivered the tablet not to Enlil-beli, but to her uncle, a senior priest. Along with it, he brought offerings, a pair of doves, a jar of fine honey, and a woven cloth embroidered with the sign of Ishtar. A week passed. Then the priest summoned him with a nod and simply said, "She agrees." The wedding was held 3 weeks later, during the month of Abu, when the winds were warm and the pomegranate trees were heavy with fruit. It took place in their family courtyard, where both houses met. Clay lanterns lined the walls, flickering gently. The fig tree in the center had been decorated with long silken threads dyed in blue and gold. Neighbors, scribes, and temple servants came bearing gifts, jars of scented oil, baskets of barley bread, amulets for luck and fertility. Enlil-beli wore a gown of white linen embroidered with silver thread, her hair braided and perfumed with cardamom. Enlil-beli wore his best robe, a deep indigo garment his father had stitched by hand, and around his neck he wore only a reed, stylus, on a thread of red wool. Together they poured oil into the flame of Nabu's altar and spoke their vows, not read from clay, but spoken softly into each other's hands. A priestess of Ishtar tied a strand of wool around their wrists, and the binding was blessed with 7 drops of water from the Euphrates. Their first meal together was shared with all present: honeyed lamb, lentil stew with dates, warm bread, and cups of pomegranate wine. Later that evening, as the guests laughed and music filled the air, Enlil-beli slipped away to their shared room. On a small tablet beside the sleeping mat, he wrote a single line: "This night I have joined with a soul who understands silence." It would be the first of many such nights, of quiet companionship, of gentle rituals, and of a love built not on grand gestures, but on presence, patience, and reverence. In the halls of power, Enlil-beli-usur was a man of precision, but in his own home he was simply a man of rhythm. His days when not claimed by palace affairs or temple scribes, followed a sacred pattern, not ordained by stars or omens, but by the quiet wisdom of routine. He woke before the city. Even before the priests lit incense in the temple courtyards, Enlil-beli was already sitting cross-legged beside the fig tree in his courtyard, a cup of warm barley broth in his hand. The first hour of morning he never spoke. It was his hour of listening to the sounds of breeze on reed screens, the rustle of birds, the city yawning itself into motion. Enlil-beli often joined him in silence. Sometimes she hummed, sometimes she simply tended to the hearth or swept the floors with her braided palms. There was no need for chatter. After years together, they had learned to speak in gestures, a glance, a nod, a shared piece of bread without a word. Meals were sacred, but simple. Morning, barley porridge with crushed dates, sometimes flavored with fig or goat's milk. Midday, lentil stew with onion and coriander, served with warm flatbread wrapped in linen. Evening, roasted vegetables from the market, goat cheese, olives, and sometimes pomegranate wine if the day had been long. He ate with his hands, always with gratitude. No meal began without a small murmur. From seed to breath, may the gods remember the hands that fed us. He did not eat for indulgence, but for renewal. Even when his position gave him access to delicacies from foreign lands, dried fish from Susa, saffron from Elam, he preferred the humble fare of his father's house. The stylus must be steady, he once said, and hunger makes it reckless. His rest was as deliberate as his meals. In the late afternoons, when the clay was drying and the palace stilled, Enlil-beli would retreat to his favorite corner of the courtyard, where sunlight filtered through a lattice of woven reeds. There, he kept a small wooden stool and a reed mat. He often napped with a clay tablet beside him, half written, as if his dreams might complete what waking thought could not. Sleep came easily to him, not because he was free of worry, but because he trusted his silence. He did not chase the future. He let it arrive, word by word. Evenings were for thought. He would walk slowly along the edges of the inner garden, fingertips brushing against the leaves. He would look to the stars and recall the names of constellations: goatfish, plough, field marker, not for astrology, but for memory. Sometimes he would speak to the night. Have I written clearly today? Have I harmed with words? Have I helped? Before bed, he often etched a single line onto a small personal tablet, not a diary, but a whisper pressed into clay. I saw a child step over an ant today, careful not to crush it. The date tree bore fruit early this year. Must be good signs. A woman sold figs in the market and gave one to a beggar, though her basket was nearly empty. He called these his clay thoughts, small observations that anchored him to the moment, to the earth, to humility. He slept on a reed mat beside his wife, under a thin linen sheet. No pillows, no perfumes, only the scent of clean clay and myrrh lingering from the altar. And always, before closing his eyes, he whispered, "Let me wake useful, or not at all." If the city of Babylon was built from clay and fire, then the marriage of Enlil-beli-usur and Enlil-beli was built from ritual and rhythm, two souls bound not by thunderous romance, but by the steady light of shared purpose. Years had passed since their wedding under the fig tree, yet to Enlil-beli, Each day with Enlil-beli felt like another wedge carefully carved, a stroke added to the long tablet of their life together. She had once been a priestess, fluent in ritual, song, and the care of the body and spirit. But after their marriage, she transitioned from temple life into something more sacred still, the invisible priesthood of home. Not lesser, only quieter. Each morning, while Enlil-beli performed his own whispered prayers to Nabu, she lit incense to Ishtar, murmuring invocations as she ground herbs and stirred barley. Their voices often overlapped, his chants measured and austere, hers melodic and fluid, two streams that flowed into a single river of breath and intention. Though both had full inner lives, they did not live separately. They moved through the house in gentle orbit. When Enlil-beli returned home, with tense shoulders from court debates or difficult transcription, he would find her already kneeling by the hearth, crushing anise and myrtle into a warm poultice to rest upon his wrists. She never asked what troubled him. She knew that silence, offered at the right moment, healed faster than words. At night, she sang low hymns from the temple, while he pressed lines into his personal tablets. On festival days, they cleaned the courtyard together, washing the altar stone, repainting the door seals, arranging dried flowers in careful concentric circles. They never rushed. Every act was a vow renewed. Their disagreements, rare but real, were quiet storms. He once spoke too harshly when she misplaced a tablet meant for royal delivery. She did not respond for 3 days, offering no anger, only silence. On the 3rd day he found a new tablet waiting on his mat, a poem she had written in his style, expressing her hurt, but also her understanding. He read it twice, then wept, then kissed her hands. Their love was not loud. It did not burn. It glowed, like the oil lamp by their bed, steady, soft, always lit. When Enlil-beli rose each morning to begin work, he would pause beside her sleeping form and press his fingers gently to her temple in blessing. When she returned from the market, she would place her hand on his tablet shelf and murmur, "Let your words hold well." They bore 4 children, each one a tablet of their own, inscribed with new patterns, shaped by the winds of time, but fired in the kiln of their care. With Tammuz, she taught discipline. With Aresh, she shared knowledge of healing. With Adapa, she encouraged wonder and questions. With Sinleki, she offered patience, knowing he would one day carry the stylus. As the years passed, they grew in quiet harmony. Their faces grew older, their hair grayed, but their gestures remained the same. Enlil-beli still left small reed flowers on her side of the mat on festival mornings. She still brewed his favorite mint drink during the dry months, adding 2 drops of honey and a pinch of sea salt, just the way he liked it. And every 7th day, when the scribe fasted to honor Nabu, she fasted with him, not out of obligation, but solidarity. They would sit together in silence, hands clasped, empty bowls between them. It was this bond, this daily renewal, this mutual sacredness, that made their marriage not a chapter in his story, but its steady ink. Though his hands were trained to write the decrees of kings and the hymns of gods, Enlil-beli-usur considered his greatest writing to be not on clay, but in the lives of his children. He often said, "Clay may crack and fade, but a well-raised child is a living tablet." His and Enlil-beli's home was not wealthy by palace standards, but it was rich in structure, ritual, and story. From the moment their children could walk, they were surrounded by tools of thought, styluses, tablets, tiny jars of ink, plants for dyes, fragments of hymns sung in the courtyard. Tammuz, the eldest. Tammuz, their firstborn son, was strong and spirited, more drawn to spear and shield than to stylus. Enlil-beli never pushed him toward scribal life. He believed each child should find their own grain, just as each reed has its own curve. But Tammuz still absorbed his father's lessons: discipline, clarity, silence before speaking. When Tammuz joined the temple guard at age 16, Enlil-beli gifted him a small tablet, carved with a simple line: "Strike only when your silence has failed." That tablet Tammuz carried, tucked into the leather band around his arm. Eresh, the healer, Eresh, their second child, showed early signs of empathy. She would gather wounded birds in the courtyard and mix salves from temple herbs under her mother's guidance. She studied the body the way her father studied language, carefully, reverently. Enlil-beli taught her to write only what was necessary. He showed her how to press emergency remedies into clay strips, quick instructions for those who couldn't read deeply. When she became a healer's apprentice, he made her a wooden box to hold her tablets and etched her name into the lid, along with a quiet blessing to Gula, goddess of healing. Adapa, the stargazer. Adapa was quiet, observant, and curious about the sky. While other children played with toys, he arranged pebbles into star charts. He asked questions that made even Enlil-beli pause. If Nabu writes fate, does he ever erase it? Can the wind change what's written in clay? Is the moon lonely? Rather than answering directly, Enlil-beli would hand him a tablet and say, "Write your question. Let the clay respond." They would sit on the roof together at night, watching stars while reciting the names of constellations. Enlil-beli sometimes believed that Adapa's soul was older than his own. Sinleki, the shadow scribe. The youngest, Sinleki, was different. He watched his father constantly, mimicking his gestures, even his silences. He would sit beside him for hours in the scriptorium, not speaking, just observing how the stylus moved, how the ink dried, how the tablet was smoothed before every new inscription. At age 6, he pressed his first full line into clay. "My father writes like rivers flow." Enlil-beli smiled and said nothing. That night, he placed a stylus beside Sinleki's mat and whispered, "Yours now." As a father, Enlil-beli-usur was never harsh. He believed discipline was a form of memory. When his children erred, he told them stories from old tablets, cautionary tales encoded in myth. When they succeeded, he did not flatter, but gave thanks aloud before the family altar. He often gathered them at twilight beneath the fig tree, where he recited tales from ancient kings, foolish merchants, clever farmers, and the gods themselves. He let them ask questions. He let them retell the stories differently. He wanted them not just to remember, but to reshape meaning. In their home, education was not confined to clay or scroll. It was woven into meals, dreams, games, songs, and silence. And as the years passed, and each child began to carve their path outward from the family home, Enlil-beli never asked that they stay. He only said, "Go carefully, keep your soul steady, and when you write Write as though your great-grandchild may read it some day. Before the first rooster stirred, or the sunlit bricks of the ziggurat warmed, Enlil-beli-usur was already awake. His life, though immersed in the affairs of empire, was governed not by royal clocks, but by a deeper rhythm. A sacred order he kept faithfully each day. He did not leap from bed. He rose as a candle does, quietly, deliberately. His mat, laid near the altar niche in the eastern corner of the home, faced the rising sun. This placement was intentional, for to Enlil-beli, direction was not just spatial, it was spiritual. East was where the gods began their watching. The first act of his morning was ablution. He poured water from a clay jug into a small bronze basin, washing his hands, his mouth, and his eyes. This was not for cleanliness, but clarity. Let no lie remain on my hands. Let no false word rest on my lips. Let no shadow cloud my sight. These words he murmured each dawn, tracing his face with wet fingertips in a gesture older than Babylon itself. After this, he approached the small house altar, where 3 small idols stood. Nabu, god of writing, who bore the stylus and the tablet. Shamash, god of justice, whose rays illuminated truth. Gula, goddess of healing, whom his wife had honored, and who now watched over his aging bones. He lit incense, frankincense or crushed cedar, depending on the season, and offered a few grains of barley and drops of milk into a shallow bowl. Then he stood with arms crossed, eyes closed, reciting a prayer not meant for favor, but alignment. Let me not shape the clay with pride. Let me not wound with my words. Let me not vanish into noise. Only after this did he speak to another person, usually Ninlil-beli, a kiss on her temple, a soft inquiry about her dreams. They would drink warm barley water together, in silence beneath the fig tree, both freshly aligned with the day's breath. The sacred walk. His walk to the palace was, itself, a ritual. He took the same path each day, past the potter's square, where children waved and women bartered, past the olive vendor, who always nodded but never spoke, past the old wall where moss grew in the same shape, year after year. He often touched the wall as he passed it. The moss remembers, he would whisper, so must I. As he entered the scriptorium, he paused at the threshold, placed his fingers upon the lintel, and then touched his stylus to his brow. This, he believed, anchored his intellect to humility. Before he began any work, he sorted his styluses. Each had a purpose. The fine tipped for poetry and prayers, the flat blade for proclamations, the double reed for duplicate entries, and one stylus, dulled with age, was only for writing his private thoughts. He worked without haste. He believed that the gods disliked speed. Speed was for merchants and messengers, not for those who shaped words meant to endure centuries. At midday he stopped, regardless of what task remained unfinished. He believed rest was not laziness, but reverence for the body, which the gods had shaped no less carefully than the stylus. In the afternoon, he sometimes taught a student or copied an ancient hymn for preservation. Before sunset, he always reviewed what he had written that day. If he found an error, he erased it, not just the mark, but the intention. He whispered, "Clay is forgiving, so must I be." The evening flame. At home, once the lamps were lit, he sat with his family in the courtyard. He told no stories without invitation. He waited for the children to ask. If none did, he simply smiled and recited a single line of verse, usually one that had puzzled him that day. Before sleep, he once again washed, knelt at the altar, and recorded a final reflection, sometimes just one word. One evening's entry read only, "Still." He believed that a well-lived day did not require pages, only a clean final line. To Enlil-beli-usur, writing was never just ink and clay. It was breath made visible, a form of divine mimicry, a sacred art that allowed mortals to echo the gods, not with thunder or flame, but with the tip of a reed dipped in oil and pressed into soft earth. He believed that the very act of inscription was an act of devotion. Just as the gods formed the world from formless chaos, he shaped sense from silence. Where once there was a blank slab of clay, afterward there was law, poetry, prophecy, memory. The gods created with voice, he once taught his son Sinleki, but we, poor echoes, must write, and that too is holy. He taught his apprentices that the stylus was not a tool, but a conduit. It was to be respected like a priest respects incense. A cracked stylus was never discarded with ordinary waste. Instead, it was wrapped in linen and placed in a small urn outside the scriptorium, a burial for a servant of memory. In the temple of Nabu, Enlil-beli had once seen an inscription that forever shaped his view of language. Carved into the lintel above the inner sanctum, it read, "To write is to hold time captive." He often pondered this, alone, in his courtyard, or while reviewing decrees long forgotten by those who had issued them. A forgotten law remained a law. A dead king still spoke, if his words remained pressed in clay. This gave Enlil-beli-usur both comfort and caution. He feared speaking carelessly. "A word spoken dies in the wind," he said, "but a word written may live longer than its speaker." He refused to write in anger. If he was upset, he walked. If grief clouded his thoughts, he cleaned his styluses or rewrote hymns. Only when his heart had steadied would he return to the tablet. He believed that every sign, every wedge, every line had its own weight. Even the simplest marks held symbolic power. The sign for breath resembled the curve of the wind over water. The sign for life mirrored the shoot of a young reed. The sign for truth resembled an open door. His personal stylus was carved with a line of prayer. "Let what I press into clay match what is pressed into my heart." He kept a small collection of blank tablets on a shelf in his home, wrapped in linen, awaiting the day they might be used for something worthy. Once, when asked why he didn't use them, he smiled and said, "Some clay is not ready to speak, and some thoughts are not yet formed enough to deserve listening." Above all, Enlil-beli believed that the gods had not given humans language to boast, command, or deceive, but to remember. He believed that to forget was the first sin, so he wrote. He wrote names of the poor. He wrote forgotten treaties. He wrote poems about dreams no one else would hear. He once copied, by hand, a set of temple hymns whose original had been worn illegible. He spent weeks on it and never signed his name. When asked why, he replied, "Because the gods already heard it once. I only wanted them to hear it again." He believed that Nabu, god of scribes, did not demand praise, but precision. The offering that pleased the god most was not incense or gold, but a line well formed, a record truthfully kept. Thus, every time Enlil-beli-usur pressed his stylus to clay, he imagined himself not writing, but breathing, borrowing for a moment the act of divine creation and exhaling something that might last longer than flesh. Of all the gods who moved through the stories of Babylon, Marduk, Ishtar, Shamash, it was Nabu who lived closest to Enlil-beli-usur's soul. Not because Nabu was loud, not because he ruled the skies or stirred armies, but because Nabu whispered, and Enlil-beli was a man who listened. To him, Nabu was not distant. He did not dwell only in the grand temple of Borsippa, or in the carvings on gate lintels. Nabu was present in the silence before a stylus touched clay, in the pause between words, in the weight of an unspoken thought. Where others saw a scribe's god, Enlil-beli once told his son, I saw a companion. I write beside him, not beneath him. He kept no statues of kings in his house, but on his altar Nabu stood always, carved in alabaster, small enough to fit in one hand, eyes unreadable, stylus pressed to lip in a gesture of eternal stillness. Each morning, Enlil-beli greeted him with a whispered offering, not for favor, but for alignment. Let me record not what pleases the ear, but what bears the weight of truth. Let my stylus not tremble in the face of silence. Let your breath move through mine. This was not ritual, it was conversation. When others feared omens, Enlil-beli recorded them. When others flattered kings, he captured their exact words. He believed that Nabu was not the god of agreement, but of accuracy. To write falsely in the name of power was, in his eyes, a theft from the divine. He kept one stylus sacred, never used for public tablets, only for private prayer. It was carved from driftwood found along the Euphrates, smoothed by years in the river's current. He believed Nabu led him to it. On its side, he etched a simple line. The voice that writes does not need to shout. Once a year, during the festival of Nabu in the month of Nisanu, Enlil-beli would make a pilgrimage to Borsippa, walking beside thousands of other scribes and devotees. He did not carry lavish offerings, no gold, no spices, only a single, freshly pressed tablet inscribed with his thoughts from the past year. Doubts, observations, one or two lines of verse. He would place the tablet upon the temple's offering table, bow his head, and leave without a word. When asked why he traveled so far just to say so little, he smiled, because Nabu already knows what I meant. And he did believe that. He believed that Nabu read intention, not just symbols, that a trembling hand still spoke truth, that silence, carefully carved, could carry more meaning than 10 shouted declarations. Nabu, to Enlil-beli, was not just the patron of scribes. He was the divine memory itself, the eternal witness to all things recorded and forgotten. In moments of crisis, Enlil-beli did not pray for rescue. He prayed for clarity. In moments of loss, he did not pray for comfort. He prayed for precision. Let me name it clearly, he would whisper. Let me remember rightly. That is enough. He believed that when he died, Nabu would not ask if he had written beautifully, but whether he had written faithfully, whether his lines honored the weight of what they held, whether he let others speak through his stylus rather than speaking over them. In a city ruled by kings, guided by priests, and watched over by gods, the question of fate was not a casual thought. It was a weight that hung in the air, curled in the smoke of sacrifices, pressed into tablets like the laws of stone themselves. But to Enlil-beli-usur, fate was neither punishment nor reward. It was invitation. He did not believe in a rigid destiny handed down by distant hands. He believed that fate was written in clay, not stone, soft enough to shape if one had the will and reverence to press carefully. He often said to his apprentices, "Fate does not close the door, it opens the tablet." He studied omens, as all scribes did, eclipses, births, patterns in sheep livers, the alignment of stars, but he never feared them. Instead, he saw them as the gods speaking in their softest voice, testing whether men were truly listening. Once, during a lunar eclipse, when others wailed and shuttered their homes, Enlil-beli stood calmly on the roof of his house, watching the moon's light dim into shadow. "They are not angry," he whispered to Sinleki. "They are remembering." He recorded the event, but not as a warning. He recorded it as a question, marking in the margins, "What have we forgotten, that the gods now withdraw their light?" He taught his children to notice signs, not to obey them blindly, but to reflect. A snake in the road, a bird flying backward, a cup that cracked on first pour. These were not threats. They were gentle disruptions, reminding the soul to pause. "The gods," he said, "do not shout. They interrupt. Then they wait to see if we noticed." He believed dreams, too, were divine messages, but only when remembered clearly, and never when retold in fear. When a dream stirred him from sleep, he would sit in the dark, light a lamp, and write it immediately on a scrap of clay. Then he would wait 3 days. Only then would he read it again, and decide whether it spoke to the soul or simply to the stomach. Fate, in his view, was not an iron road laid down from birth. It was a river, with current, yes, but also choice. One could drift, or one could paddle. He once inscribed on a private tablet, "The river flows, but the hand may shape the oar." When the king asked for an omen reading before a campaign, Enlil-beli reported the signs truthfully: moderate winds, a pale sun, a fox seen beneath the northern gate. He included no interpretation. "Let the king read the sky as he reads the law," he told the vizier, "and may his heart be steadier than the stars." He never claimed to know fate. He claimed only to honor it. Each time he sealed a tablet, he pressed a small spiral mark in the corner, his own silent symbol. To him, the spiral meant not the end, only the next turning. And when his wife fell ill one winter, and the physicians grew grim, he did not fight fate. He held her hand, kissed her temple, and whispered, "I will not ask them to change the writing, only to help me read it well." Enlil-beli-usur had seen kings fall, wars rise from whispers, and men condemned by a single clause. He knew, better than most, that a scribe did not merely preserve truth, he could also shape it, and that knowledge burdened him more than any seal, ring, or royal favor. To him, the stylus was not a tool, it was a blade, one that could protect or wound, depending on the hand that held it. He once told a student, "A poor warrior may kill a man, but a poor scribe may damn a generation." He believed that truth, written with precision, was an offering to Nabu, but truth distorted, for power, pride, or convenience, was a theft, not from the king, from time itself. He kept a series of tablets in a sealed box beneath his personal altar. These were copies of decrees that had been altered before public release, decrees softened to avoid scandal, rewritten to erase blame, edited to shift memory. He copied them not to resist authority, but to preserve integrity. He called this box the clay of conscience. When once asked why he did not protest such changes, he answered, "A protest shouted dies with the voice. A tablet buried lives beyond the city." He had refused to alter records before, quietly, firmly. When a royal nephew attempted to rewrite a treaty to claim greater tribute from a southern province, Enlil-beli gently returned the tablet, unmarked. "My hand does not shape lies," he said. "You may find another, but you will not find better." The nephew fumed, but did not press. For by that time, Enlil-beli's reputation was not of loyalty to men, but loyalty to memory. And the palace knew that its greatest defense against future accusation was his unwavering fidelity to what had truly been said. He was careful, even in poetry. He permitted metaphors, embellishments, poetic inversions, but never distortion of real events. He once said, "A poem may lie in structure, but never in spirit." To his children, he taught ethical clarity the way others taught prayer. If you must choose between being liked and being truthful, choose silence. If you err in your writing, confess it before the seal is pressed. If your tablet would shame your great-grandchild, break it. He spoke often of a story, a forgotten scribe from Ur, who falsified a grain count and caused a famine. His name was remembered only for that deed. "One wedge," Enlil-beli would say, "and 1,000 mouths went hungry." This was not just philosophy. This was moral discipline, a code he lived by with quiet rigor. And yet he was not rigid. He understood nuance. Once, when asked to record the king's eulogy for a beloved general who had died in shame, he adjusted the phrasing, preserving the truth, but softening the memory for the sake of the man's widow. He wrote in his private diary that night, "Sometimes mercy is the ink, and not the lie." In all his decades of service, Enlil-beli never used his position for revenge, favor, or wealth. He had influence, but he never threatened. He had access to secrets, but he never traded them. "The scribe," he said, "should leave no shadow, only reflection." Long before he learned to read, before he knew the forms of gods or the weight of kings, Enlil-beli-usur had learned to listen. He believed that silence was not the absence of sound, but a chamber where truth could echo. And so, throughout his life, he built his days not just with tablets and speech, but with long intervals of deliberate quiet, what he called his dust prayers. "Speech teaches others," he once said, "but silence teaches the self." Each morning, after his ritual ablution and offering, he would sit in the courtyard before speaking to anyone, not out of habit, but in honor of silence itself. The fig tree swayed gently, the fountain bubbled low, and Babylon stretched beyond the walls like a living scroll. In that silence, he waited for the day to begin him, not the other way around. In palace meetings, where voices clashed and advisers jostled to speak, Enlil-beli was known for his long pauses. Sometimes he would not respond to a question until moments had fully ripened. One general mocked this habit once, impatiently snapping, "Does the scribe need the gods to speak for him?" Enlil-beli only smiled and answered, "Number. But I need the noise to leave, so my answer does not carry it with it. He believed that a tablet too rushed carried panic, just as a tablet too rehearsed carried vanity. Between those, he walked a steady line. Each decision required stillness, like a pot cooling before it could be filled. Even at home, silence was sacred. His children learned that long pauses were not to be feared. Sometimes after dinner, he would stare into the flickering oil lamp for many minutes before speaking. If one of them broke the silence, he would listen, but gently remind them afterward. The gods gave us 2 ears and only 1 stylus. Let us learn the reason. The dust prayers. In the quietest hours of the night, he had a private ritual, unknown even to his children. He would gather a pinch of dust from the floor of the courtyard, swept, clean, sun-warmed, and place it on a fresh tablet. Then he would press 1 line into it. Not a wish, not a command, just an observation, a kindness seen, a mistake remembered, a beauty forgotten. The date seller gave a blind man the fullest fruit. The wind carried a child's song farther than the market bell. I spoke when I should have waited. He called these dust prayers because they were not meant to be saved. At week's end, he would dissolve them in a jar of water and pour it at the base of the fig tree. Let the earth hold what I am not strong enough to keep, he whispered. He taught his apprentices this ritual, but never forced it upon them. Some write to be remembered, he told them, but it is a finer thing to write and then release. To Enlil-beli, listening was not passive. It was spiritual architecture, the only way to hear what the gods whispered in ordinary things. A broken reed, a cracked bowl, the space between a father and his son at dusk. In one of his final dust prayers, long after his wife had passed and his children had grown, he pressed this line into clay. Today, no one spoke to me, but I heard everything. He then brushed the clay smooth again and smiled. The year Enlil-beli turned 39, Babylon entered what came to be known as the season of still winds. For weeks, the air lay heavy over the city. The Euphrates barely stirred. The reeds did not rustle. Even the temple drums seemed quieter, as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. Smoke from altars rose straight into the sky, thin and undisturbed. The people whispered, uneasy. When the wind does not speak, they said, something else soon will. It was during this unsettling quiet that the king's only son, Prince Marduk-appeal, fell ill. What began as a fever became something deeper, a trembling in the limbs, a shadow in the eyes, a quiet that crept beneath the bones. The palace physicians applied compresses, burned incense, offered goat liver to divine the cause. Nothing availed. The prince, barely 12 years old, lay pale upon linen woven with royal seals. Priests whispered of curses. Courtiers speculated on succession. The king, Samsu-iluna, once resolute and unshakable, grew gaunt with worry. He stopped attending councils. He walked the palace halls in silence, clutching clay idols, staring at the still sky as if it might finally give an answer. And then he summoned Enlil-beli-usur, not to write, but to witness. The request came at midnight. A servant arrived with a torch and a sealed order. "Bring your stylus," the message read, "but do not write unless you must." Enlil-beli entered the royal chamber barefoot, as was required in times of divine affliction. The air was thick with incense. The prince lay motionless, his breath shallow, a damp cloth resting on his forehead. The king sat nearby, his eyes dull with sleeplessness. "They have spoken spells and scattered ashes," the king said, "but he drifts further. What do the records say? Have you seen this before?" Enlil-beli knelt beside the boy, touching the edge of the mat. "The records say little," he answered, "but the clay remembers kindness better than cure." And then, breaking all protocol, he did something he had never done before. He wrote a prayer, not a record, not a decree, not an account. He pressed a soft tablet with a simple invocation, not addressed to Marduk or Shamash, but to Gula, goddess of healing. "Let this child return to breath. Let the still winds part for his name. Let the clay be shaped again." He placed the tablet beneath the prince's bed, beside the bronze lion used in purification rites. Then he sat in the corner and waited. 3 days passed. On the 4th morning, just as the sun crested the eastern wall, the stillness broke. A single breeze entered the room, stirring the incense smoke. The prince's eyes fluttered open. "Father," he whispered. The king wept. So did the guards outside the door. Enlil-beli said nothing. He simply retrieved the prayer tablet, wrapped it in linen, and handed it to the high priest. That evening, he returned home, laid his stylus before the altar, and wrote in his personal tablet, "I did not write to remember. I wrote to ask." From that moment forward, his role changed. He was no longer just the keeper of records. He became the keeper of trust. The king consulted him not only on treaties, but on dreams, on fears, on omens. He was summoned not only to write, but to listen. He refused rewards, titles, lands. "Let me remain where I was," he told the king, "for the river flows best when undisturbed." But the palace guards began to nod more deeply as he passed. The young scribes began copying his form with reverence, and the prince, when recovered, carried a small version of Enlil-beli's prayer tablet in a pouch around his neck. It was never meant for power, but his silence had become a voice the king trusted more than any trumpet. After the season of still winds and the healing of the young prince, Enlil-beli-usur found that his days had changed, but not in the way most would expect. He did not seek a palace office, though one was offered. He did not move into the scribe's quarters near the temple, though a private chamber had been prepared. He did not adorn his name with titles or seals. Instead, he returned to his home in the shadow of the fig tree and wrote poems, not for the court, not for the gods, for himself. His mornings were unchanged, ablutions, incense, silence, but now his afternoons, once filled with courtly decrees and audience records, were given to stillness. Beneath the fig tree, beside a bowl of dates and a cup of goat's milk, he wrote in soft clay, "A drop of water finds its shape faster than a crown. The child who watches ants learns more than the soldier who counts horses. What did the sun forget today? That the flower still bloomed." He called them garden verses, and unlike official records, they bore no formality. Some were only a line or two. Some ended mid-thought. A few were pressed into reused clay, over faded trade lists or tax ledgers. He did not care. He said that poetry should bloom where it may. He taught Sinleki to shape them too, not to seek beauty, but to notice it. And soon, the child's own verses joined his father's on the shelves. One afternoon, Enlil-beli found this written on a corner of an unused tablet. Father sneezed during his silence. The fig tree laughed. He did not correct it. He smiled and placed it in the finest box he owned, returning to the fig tree. As the years passed, the fig tree became more than a tree. It became a shrine of memory. It had shaded his cradle. It had cooled his first kiss. It had caught the echoes of his children's laughter. And now it stood beside him as he aged, its branches broader, its roots deeper, its bark grained with the same marks that time had etched into his hands. Sometimes people came from the city to seek his advice, not on war, but on wording, on oaths, on apologies, on how to say a thing so it might last. He never charged a fee. He only asked, "Do you intend it truly?" If they hesitated, he would send them away with a smile. He no longer attended the full Akitu procession, though he still offered incense from his gate. When asked why, he replied, "The gods know where I sit. I don't think they mind the distance." His poems began to shift, no longer just observations, but farewells. Today, I saw a boy carve his name on the ziggurat wall. His stylus will fade, but the wind will remember. I have fewer tablets now, but more time to read the birds. When I was young, I listened to the king. Now, I listen to the cup when it is empty. He stopped sealing his poems. He said they weren't for keeping. He gave some to neighbors. He buried some near the fig tree. He broke a few deliberately, whispering, "Some thoughts are too delicate to endure." And still, each day he wrote, even when his hands trembled, even when his breath came short, even when the clay grew heavy. He told his children, "When my voice is gone, press the tablet. The words will hum." Enlil-beli-usur had long believed that death was not a punishment, but a punctuation, not the end of meaning, but the end of a sentence. The silence that followed was not absence, but the beginning of understanding. He had watched others die with fear, with confusion, with anger. He hoped only to die with clarity. In his final year, the mornings came slower. His stylus moved more carefully. His prayers grew shorter, but his eyes, always, remained bright, steady, observant, still listening. He told no one when he felt the shift in his body. He told no one when food lost taste. He told no one when sleep came without dreams. But one morning, he woke earlier than usual. The fig tree's branches glowed silver with dew. He washed his hands as always, lit incense to Nabu, and pressed a final tablet, not large, not ornate, just a modest square of soft clay. With trembling fingers, he wrote, "I have said what I could. The silence will say the rest." He pressed his stylus beside it, sideways, not upright, a symbol of closing. Then he wrapped the tablet in linen, placed it in a sealed jar, and gave it to Sinleki. "Do not open it for a year," he whispered. "Then plant it beneath the fig tree. That will be enough." He asked for no parade, no hymn, no carving, only a mat in the courtyard and the stars above. That night, he sat quietly beside his altar, watching the flame dance low. His breath slowed. His hands rested on his knees. When dawn came, he was still. The burial. They did not bury him in the palace crypts, though he had earned it. They did not lay him beside kings or generals. They buried him beneath the fig tree, the same one that had shaded his birth, his courtship, his children, and his poems. Sinleki placed the sealed jar where the roots spread deepest, and above it, on a single smooth stone, he carved his father's own words. Write as if your great-grandchild may read it some day. It was the year 2024 when the first shard was uncovered. A joint excavation team, composed of Iraqi archaeologists and a handful of visiting scholars, was digging near the site of ancient Babylon, where a fig tree once stood, its descendants now long vanished beneath centuries of dust and conquest. Most of the team believed they were surveying an old grain storage area, or perhaps an overlooked merchant quarter, but then they found something out of place. Not walls, not coins, but a stylus, perfectly preserved, carved from dark driftwood, smoothed by centuries, still bearing a faint line in cuneiform. The voice that writes does not need to shout. At first, it was thought to be a ceremonial item, but then they found the clay. Dozens of tablets, some cracked, others astonishingly intact, buried in a sealed chamber beside a circle of river stones. One bore a single spiral in the corner. Another was a prayer to Gula. One recorded a forgotten eclipse. One simply read, "I have said what I could. The silence will say the rest." And beside it, buried slightly deeper, wrapped in brittle linen and sealed with ancient wax, was a funerary tablet naming a man who had never appeared in Babylon's royal lists, nor in its mythic histories, but who had written its breath. Enlil-beli-usur, scribe of the fifth court, witness of wind, son of dust, keeper of silence. The tablet room. When the tablets were cleaned and translated, a quiet astonishment spread among the scholars. These were not royal decrees, not the usual inventories or tax records. These were personal reflections, ethical meditations, poems, parables, a full philosophy of life captured in cuneiform. One tablet described a child placing her hand on a fig leaf and whispering thanks to the tree. Another described the smell of fresh-baked barley bread cooling on a clay shelf. Another detailed the ethics of rewriting a general's history with compassion rather than condemnation. They were human, uncommonly so, not mythic, not grand, just clear. And most astonishing of all, many tablets bore no seal, no boast, no desire to be remembered. They had been written for no audience but the gods, and yet they had survived. The archaeologists erected a small exhibit in Baghdad. They called it Whispers from the Clay. Visitors came and wept, not for the grandeur of the discovery, but for its gentleness, its humility, for the idea that a man had once lived who had asked for nothing except to write faithfully. And at the center of the exhibit, placed beneath glass, beside the stylus and a faded reed flower fossilized in dust, sat the final tablet of Enlil-beli-usur. Write as if your great-grandchild may read it some day. They did. The dust of Babylon is older than any kingdom, older than any god remembered by name. Empires rose upon it, and empires fell. Stones shifted, walls vanished, names were forgotten. But words, once pressed into clay by steady hands, endured. Enlil-beli-usur never ruled. He never led an army. He never claimed divine favor. He never sought to be remembered. Yet his voice remains, soft, truthful, enduring like a reed that bends but does not break. In a world obsessed with grandeur, it was his humility that lingered. A single line about silence, a poem about wind, a broken prayer buried beneath a tree. And somehow, thousands of years later, in glass-lit halls and quiet classrooms, his breath moves again, read aloud by children, whispered by scholars, written into modern tongues, not because he asked, because he listened, because he wrote faithfully, because he believed that memory was sacred. And now, a new reader, you, has joined the long river of those who have heard him. Enlil-beli once said, "The stylus fades, but the truth hums." It does. And somewhere, in a quiet place beyond time, the scribe who once wrote by lamplight beneath a fig tree smiles, not with pride, but with peace.